And now, the Rock Newman Show. And
folks, welcome back to the Rock Newman Show. Today is Saturday, January the 11th, 2014. We're broadcasting live from the Langston Hughes Room at Busboys and Ports at 14th and V Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. And I am so happy to have this individual as my guest this hour. I actually started talking to him way back in 2013 about coming on the show, and finally our schedules have meshed such that we could get in today. Ethelbert Miller, thank you so much for joining us here on the Rock Newman Show.
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, man. Poet, teacher, author, on and on and on, about 12 other titles I could give, but just someone that I'm really happy to have here on the Rock Newman Show. Let's start on a bit of a sad note. Sad, but it gives us pause to celebrate a genius who was amongst us that departed on Thursday. Amiri Baraka. If I'm saying that name properly.
Amiri Baraka.
Amiri Baraka, formerly Leroy Jones. I read something, I think, that was in the Washington Post that said that his commentary was offensive, something to this effect, offensively brutal, but achingly painful. That's a hell of a description there.
Well, you know, we sometimes can talk about African-American music the same way. You know, you listen to Albert Ayler or Charlie Parker, you may have the same reaction. But I think that when we look at Baraka, you know, we have to place him alongside, you know, Ellison, Wright, Baldwin, Hughes. What I admire about Baraka...
That's some high cotton right there. That's high cotton.
I mean,
right
we're talking about the canon. We're talking about the tradition.
Yeah.
You know, if you look at my life, okay, you cannot go from the 1950s to the present without dealing with some aspect of Baraka's work that touches us. And that's everything from poetry, theater, African-American politics, music. You know, it's that breadth of his work. It touches all of us in terms of whatever our ideas are. Even discussing blackness today.
Yeah.
Okay, we take for granted, you know, the Black Arts Movement, the Black Power period. Amiri Baraka is key to that. You know, and as a literary person, I go back and always look at the fact that sometimes we never gave him the full credit of the beat movement. You know, we talk about Allen Ginsberg and other people like that, but during the 1950s, you know, people like Bob Kaufman, Ted Jones, A.B. Spellman, there was a strong black presence in the beat movement. And Leroy Jones, that was his name at that time, and his wife Hetty Cohen was actually publishing some of these writers, you know, publishing Ginsberg, not just reading with them, but publishing them.
Right. Let me ask you. This might, boy, I don't want to be an ungracious host and ask you a too difficult question. But don't you hate when people do that?
Well, I expect that. You know, being a literary activist, you know, I go back and look at how, for example, when Gwendolyn Brooks died, we reduced it to We Real Cool.
Yeah.
You know, we reduce people to, like, you know, one composition.
Yeah.
Or, for example, we talk about Malcolm X.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about El Hajj Malik Shabazz. Yeah. You know.
So what I didn't want to do was to put you on the spot too much, and if I do, we can move right on past it. How would you eulogize Amiri Baraka if this were the pulpit? First of all, you probably would have prepared, I would think, but without any opportunity for preparing to do so, how would you eulogize him?
Well, I would look at eulogies in terms of that, what he did. You know, I mean, he did a book, which I make reference to, Eulogies, which came out in the 90s. When you look at when Baraka did a eulogy, and just take Larry Neal, he put that particular individual in a certain context. So if, for example, you ask me to look at Amiri Baraka, okay, I would begin in terms of the personal impact first. Okay, I'm in Howard University, just like you were. Okay, I'm in Cook Hall Dormitory, and I come across Black Fire, a key anthology that he edited with Larry Neal. So I begin there. Okay, then because I become interested in poetry, I now move into Black Magic poetry. Okay, now because I want to find out more about him, I'm reading The Dutchman. Okay, I'm reading.
Can we stop there? Right. Can we stop with The Dutchman? Because I never saw it. and I saw a 12-minute clip about 4 o'clock this morning, and I wanted to see it and go back to sleep for a couple of hours before I came to do this show. I could not go back to sleep after seeing that 12-minute clip. Talk to us about talk to us about the impact of the Dutchman.
The Dutchman is what really projected, Leroy Jones at that time into becoming a major figure, especially in terms of theater. I think if you look at what was happening in terms of black presence in the theater, you have Lorraine Hansberry, Raising the Sun, and now you have this young Leroy Jones, who even Shock Langston used at that time.
Right.
If you look at how we...
You said Shocked Langston Hughes at that time. Right.
If you looked at that Dutchman in terms of issues of race, black men, black women, all in there, just two actors.
Yeah.
Just look at the dialogue. Okay,
Yeah.
See, now you saw the production.
Yeah.
Okay, I always tell people see plays, but then also read plays if you want to admire the craftsmanship of the playwright.
Yeah.
In this case, when you look at what Leroy Jones at that time was doing, it's fascinating. And it still holds up. I think that when you produce quality novels or quality plays, look at how they hold up over the span of history. So, for example, we know how great August Wilson was.
Right.
Those plays are timeless.
Right.
And when we look at, getting back to the whole thing of eulogizing Baraka, we begin with, the Dutchman and the anthology, and then we move into what we saw at the anniversary of 50 years, Blues People.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to understand the blues?
Yeah.
You got to read Blues People. Okay,
Yeah.
now you might disagree with Baraka's interpretation of the blues, like Ralph Ellison.
Sure.
I mean, Ralph Ellison reviewed the book and said, "I think Leroy Jones or Amiri Baraka gave the blues, but that's because he didn't want to put the blues in a social political context. He wanted to make it personal. So, but here is Baraka giving a key book. Now, what also makes his life very important is he just doesn't pop up and change from Leroy Jones or Amiri Baraka. He's affected by the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah.
So if you want to understand the impact of Cuba on him, then you read his collection of essays, Home.
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
And you see the transformation of how he's radicalized in Cuba, and then he comes back to the States, and he begins to see Malcolm X in a different perspective. And that's the radicalization of him. And if you look at his contributions also, and I look at this in terms of I did an interview with Larry Neal many, many years ago.
Yeah.
And I asked Larry Neal, what made Baraka so important when he met him? And he said when Baraka came from Greenwich Village, up into Harlem, what he knew, other than most of the others up in Harlem, Baraka knew the music. Baraka knew the music. And we're talking everything from R&B to blues to jazz.
Right.
And so if we just wanted to teach young people about African American music, we got to go to Baraka's work.
Yeah. So if we go back to that subway scene, part of what I read, it was like how it was introduced was saying that he was on the he was on the subway, and this lady
Lula
seduced him,
Right. Clay.
and then she stabbed him in the heart. Now I asked Mark Lassiter, who is our, just nobody's a better producer than Mark Lassiter. There would be no Rock Newman Show if it wasn't for Mark Lassiter. I said, it cut off, and I didn't see an actual stabbing. So I don't know if that took place. Did an actual stabbing take place, or was it a metaphor?
What is the whole thing of Dutchman? The key thing of that play is that after Clay is stabbed, another black person enters. It's a constant relationship.
Somebody and played by a young Morgan Freeman.
Right. Al Freeman.
Al Freeman. I'm sorry, I said Morgan Freeman. Yeah,
right.
Played by young Al Freeman. Right. And what did the Dutchman do to open up opportunities for others, if anything?
Well, it was an award-winning play, and keep in mind, I'm talking about the black person in theater. That's why I went back to talk about Lorraine Hansberry and Raising the Sun, because you had this sort of transference. But then you look at the images that Baraka is putting on the stage, and this is where you begin to see his politics and the strength of his writing. And then there's references in there. If I recall, Clay explains to Lula, he said, look, you enjoy all this Bessie Smith music. If Bessie Smith had killed one white person, she wouldn't have sang the blues.
Right,
that was a powerful statement to go back and look at, you know. But here is, once again, Baraka giving you a play that might make you uncomfortable, but moves you ahead in terms of your consciousness.
Makes you think.
Right.
Sure, makes you think. Okay, I stopped your eulogy at
I didn't even get the Black Arts movement.
No, I stopped it. I stopped it at the Dutchman.
Right. Yeah, I think
take it forward.
I think you move forward. I think a key thing that impacts Baraka would probably be 1965, where you have the assassination of Malcolm X, because that radicalizes him, and that really pushes him, forward in terms. Well, let me go back, because when he's in Cuba, he will meet Robert Williams.
When was he in Cuba?
He was in Cuba right around 1960, so he's right there after the revolution of 1959.
Right.
Okay. So what happens is around 65, you really begin to see this sort of black consciousness, and he moves into Harlem, and this is where you begin to see, as some people say, the beginning of the black arts movement. Okay. This is why some people will say that Amiri Baraka was the father of the black arts movement. But then you have people like Marvin X who say, well, we didn't have any fathers.
For history's sake, he was married to Cohen. What was her first name?
Hetty Cohen.
He was married to Hetty Cohen. Right. How long did they stay married?
They were married for a period of time in terms of, this is the key relationship that develops in the 1950s. Hetty Cohen, or Hetty Jones, has a fantastic memoir, How I Became Hetty Jones. Because she gave up a lot in terms of the fact that here you're dealing with interracial marriage in the 1950s. Okay, that's illegal. Also, when we talk about Baraka, we have to talk about his family. Out of that union would give us two wonderful writers, Lisa Jones and Kelly Jones. I mean, if you look at Kelly Jones in terms of her contribution as an African-American critic of visual arts, it's phenomenal.
Okay. Now, so he is radicalized in Cuba. So they got together in the 50s. He's radicalized. Malcolm X dies in 65. Were they still together?
No, what happens is, and this is where How I Became Hetty Jones is a fantastic memoir. What happens is that Baraka is leaning this way, around 64, 65, and she realizes how the movement is calling him. Because after he came back from Cuba, he realized he couldn't hang out with Allen Ginsberg and the Franco Harris and stuff, because all of a sudden, people are saying, okay, what is your work about? And all of a sudden, he leaves Greenwich Village and goes up to Harlem. And there's a scene that Hetty Jones writes about in her memoir, in which he comes back to get his clothes. And what
comes back to the house they were living in.
Right. And what happens is that they embrace each other, and she realizes they have to go.
And folks who might not understand, Hetty Cohen, Hetty Jones was a white Jewish lady,
and writer.
And here is Baraka. Here is Leroy Jones coming into Baraka, becoming radicalized, moving up to Harlem. And there's a premise. I heard someone say something to Alfre Woodard one night in Hollywood. I personally heard this. This strong black civil rights worker out of New Orleans. We were sitting at a table together with Alfre Woodard. Her husband got up to go to the bathroom, a white guy. And he told her, said, I love you and I love all of your work. I didn't know what was going to come out of his mouth. But he said, you could never realize your fullest potential while you're with that white man.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because something I didn't mention, I'll go back. If you go back, this is the Dutchman, okay? They're going to do the Dutchman at Howard University. They invite a young Leroy Jones down to Howard University. So Leroy Jones, and Hetty writes about it, he's packing his stuff. And what happens, he said, well, what about me? I'm coming with you. And she says, no, I don't want you to come. And she realized it was the first time that race had come between him. And she writes how she knew he didn't want to come down to Howard University, a historic black school, with a white wife.
And be embarrassed by this white woman.
And dealing with the fact that he's the Dutchman. So it's a fascinating thing in terms of going in behind these stories and looking at people as people and how these relationships develop and what tears them apart.
Yeah. Do you think that her being a white woman and him being a black man was a big factor in them not being together anymore?
I think so, but keep in mind, when we talk not being together, I think they were still very close. And I think that when you see that, you look at Kelly Jones' book, I Minded, in which she puts a book together that brings her mother and father together, okay? Sometimes we read these things and we think that they're splits, but then that's necessarily like people still maintain. Okay, this is my father, this is my mother.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, what happened on Hetty Jones' side? Her father never spoke to her again. You know, when she hooked up with Leroy Jones.
Sure.
You know, but at the same time, when Leroy separates from Hetty, Baraka's mother says, "Bring them grandchildren over here." Bring them grandchildren over here. You know, and then you still saw that the Hetty Jones family was still loved by Baraka's family.
Mm-hmm. You know, I wonder how much that relationship, what effect, if any, it might have had on, or what prompting it might have had in making of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner.
Well, it would have an impact on a lot of people's work in terms, I think, if we analyze, you know, keeping focused on Baraka, when we see a lot of the tensions, you know, between black and white in some of his early plays and stuff, a lot of that is coming out of his personal life, I would say.
Sure.
Okay, and I was fortunate here in Washington to be around Professor Ted Hudson, who wrote the first book on Leroy Jones or Amiri Baraka.
Sure.
And so, you know, many people were looking at, you know, these works that he was creating and say, okay, some of this is political, but some of this is also personal, you're saying. And so we have to begin to look at that in perspective. And also, in terms of Baraka, just getting back to the eulogy, you have to make sure that we see the person in transition. So the same way we're talking about, you know, the late 60s, continuing on the eulogy, I would say this, as we get into the late 60s, then we look at the Black Arts Movement, okay? And this goes back to this book. Even though we give credit and say, oh, Baraka, you know, and others might have been, you know, the key person, people starting the Black Arts Movement, it is at Jimmy Baldwin's funeral in the late 80s where Baraka gives the eulogy. And this is Baraka.
Yeah.
And he says, the Black Arts Movement started with Jimmy Baldwin and his play Blues for Mr. Charlie. Yeah. Okay? And so this is amazing because here you begin to see Baldwin in another way. Okay? You know, even Malcolm X talks about Baldwin in a certain way. And Baraka, you know, and maybe I should also say, as I mentioned about Lorraine Hansberry, I should also mention that, you know, at the same time he's doing the Dutchman, Baldwin also has a key place in terms of African American theater with Amen Corn and other productions, Blues for Mr. Charlie. So you can see those plays changing, you know, Baraka's thinking.
I hear the music in my ear telling us to go to a break. We're not going to do it. We're going to stay right here. We're not going to do it. We're going to stay right here. I've got a question.
And I'm only up to 1965.
You are only up to 1965. We've got an hour to talk about 12 hours worth of stuff. Ethelbert, I've been trying to get you for a long time. So now, the first book I ever read of any real substance from cover to cover was Claude Brown, Man, Child, in the Promised Land.
Right.
Now, that fits right all up in here what we're talking about right now.
There's a beautiful image of Claude Brown in On Color Us Black, that famous documentary that documents the Howard University student movement, you know, 67, 68. And they interview Claude Brown, and Claude Brown is walking around Howard's campus, and he says makes this statement. If Howard doesn't come around, you know, somebody should maybe burn it down to the ground and plant cotton. At least it has some economical value. Wow. That's a powerful statement. Yeah. You know? Yeah. And then when you talk about, you know, great books, the books that radicalize a generation, Man Child Promised Land did that. You see, Man Child Promised Land, you know, people went to put that in their pocket.
I'm telling you, Man Child in the Promised Land had an immeasurable impact on me. I mean, it as a country boy growing up out in a little rural area, it just put me in touch with a life that I knew nothing of. And it just peeled back layers from my eyes and opened them up in a way to allow me to see things. That book had immeasurable impact.
And when you say that, okay, you could have a person who's Puerto Rican over here say, here's Perry Thomas, and Down These Mean Streets did the same thing for me as a Puerto Rican as Claude Brown's Man Child in the Promised Land. And I think this is very important in terms of there are key books in certain cultures that give you a sense of who you are.
Right. You know, I just took my watch off here. Because in that book, he talks about the expert ability to be able to bump into somebody. That's what makes me think about it. I didn't take my watch off for that. But to be able to bump in somebody and to talk to them and say, hey, how you doing? Right. And walk away with a, you know, expensive watch in their pocket. And I remember being at Howard University.
Somebody took your watch.
As a freshman. If I had not read that book, this watch that my mama gave me for my 19th birthday. Somebody would have had it, but when he bumped into me, I immediately.
Well, you know, see what happens, bro. If you had read those little announcements that they put in your little freshman brochure thing,
Yeah.
always walk in groups of 5 and 6.
I wasn't paying much attention to that. I wasn't paying much attention to that. So we're right in here now. We're right in. We're right in that 65 area, and I just had to bring Claude Brown up there. Now Malcolm is dead. February 22nd, I think.
Yeah, February 65.
February 22nd, 65.
And what happens, you begin to see, you know, in fact, after that, the assassination of Malcolm, later in August 65, we have the watch riots.
Yep.
Okay? And what the watch riots will do, it will change the vocabulary of America, because everybody would ask, what happened in Watts? Why did Watts explode? And the response was that Watts was either a revolt, a rebellion, or a revolution. Okay, and out of that watch riot would also come the Watch Writers Workshop, and out of the Watch Writers Workshop you get your Jane Cortez, you get your Stanley Crouches, you get your Quincy Troop, and PBS would do a documentary on the Watch Writers Workshop, and that would have an impact on black artists around the country. So you see some key things happening. Okay,
Right.
and then what happened? We know when we look at the East and West Coast, the rise of black consciousness. You know, you have Karanga.
Yeah.
On the West Coast, you have Baraka, you know. That coming together is very important. And around the early 1970s, we really begin to see Baraka having this real national impact leading up into the African Congress. But here at Howard, going back to here, in 1973, we developed the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at Howard University under the leadership of Dr. Stephen Henderson, my mentor.
Right.
We opened our first program with a symposium that honors Gwendolyn Brooks and Amiri Baraka. We bring all people together because what started happening here in the early 70s, we began to look back and say, what happened in terms of this black arts movement? How did it change America? And we saw Baraka as being key to that.
Wow. You brought up a name, Karinga. We just celebrated Kwanzaa.
Right.
And there's always been controversy surrounding Karinga. Was he a paid government
Like you.
informant? Informant. You know one thing? That's funny that you
Right.
say like you, because here's the problem with that.
Right.
You can say that about
anybody,
You,
right.
you
Exactly,
can
right,
say that. You can
right,
say that about
right.
anybody.
But let me look at this. If you're into the boxing stuff,
Yeah.
so you're a betting man. Okay. If I told you to bet on the Afro pick, the dashiki, or Kwanzaa to survive, which would you take?
Yeah.
Probably the Afro pick, wouldn't you?
Right.
But when you look at what Karangas did, okay, and I remember when we had the Tulsa Black University Conference in '69, he came in and he had this, what black people need is a mythology. The reason why, Rock, you don't know who you are is because you have not, you remember that? And now, you know what, I just realized, I got to ask you something. Because there's all these people who always spoke with like Tyson with the high voices, like Huey Newton, power to the people. You know, I mean, what the hell, what's with that, man? You know, but what happened is that, you know, we got to look at, Karanga did something that you'd have to put next to Elijah Muhammad and Master Fard selling silk in Detroit. What happened is to take and realize that black people need a mythology.
Yeah.
You see, now you got some Africans say, Kwanzaa, what are you talking about? You must have found that in the Middle Passage.
Sure, right.
But what happened, the intention is key, okay? And Karanga realized that if we were going to have any sort of revolution, and this was the term that was used back then, that the first battle was a battle over our minds, that we had to change it. And you look up, today Kwanzaa is bigger today than it was before.
Yeah.
Now, see me, I was a Christmas tree guy,
Yeah, sure.
smuggling my Christmas tree in so when my kids would grow up with Santa Claus.
Of course.
You look a little like Santa Claus.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Ho, ho, ho. Ho, ho, ho.
But anyway, on a serious note, what happened is that we saw that here was a change in the thinking of black people.
After all, Santa Claus is a white man.
Right. And keep in mind this. Look at how many people today are named after the principles of Kwanzaa, okay? And I was in Salt Lake City and thought I would never find somebody named Kukashakalia. But then somebody said, hey, brother, my name is Kukashakalia. And he was in Salt Lake City somewhere, you know what I mean? So to show you how man, I mean, that you have to give Karenga that. You know, I mean, I mean, that is amazing to get black people, especially the black middle class.
Yeah. I was having a conversation with someone who was attempting to convince me that he was a fraud. And part of the rationale was saying that, you know, I was there early. I was there early. Right. I was around early. And
Kwanzaa reminds you of Hanukkah with the candles.
No, not that.
Not that.
But that what he was doing is he was talking about, he had all these women. And he was talking about African culture, and that in African culture, you know, there was polygamy,
right? And
that was some of the the reason. And I said, and part of what I said is, you know, I wasn't really familiar and don't really have the context to be able to argue it. What I know though is that as an academician, what he has done and sort of. He's established something like you said that was established in '67, whenever it was, that is bigger today than before. Get credit where credit is due. I don't know about the rest of the stuff.
Well, we also need a scholar to come in and maybe pull aside someone like Jimmy Garrett and introduce him about the whole polygamy thing. You know, you know, this is where I come as a literary activist. I'm always interviewing people. You know, and Jimmy Garrett is a name a lot of people don't mention. But if you go back and look at the Black Fire anthology, look at a play that Jimmy Garrett has in there. You know, We Own the Night, which was a very controversial play because in that play. The key character is killing his mother because of the revolution. Some people say, we got some problems here, Jimmy Garrett. But Jimmy Garrett was just his views on men and women and the Center of Black Education that was here. I mean, when I came here as a young person, Jimmy Garrett was a brilliant individual in terms of black studies and things of that sort. But I do remember some of those ideas of polygamy and stuff coming out of that in terms of his thinking, too. And you can probably go and dig up some old Hakimata Booty Black Books Bulletin and there's essays about polygamy. You see, people, what happens, we'll discuss these things today.
Right.
When you go back and document the stuff, some of the stuff sounds crazy.
Yeah.
But when you document it and look at it and say, well, how did this become this? You see, then it's very important to pass that information on to the next generation.
So we're in the 60s now.
Then I would bring this in terms of, I know you got a time.
No. What I'm talking about is I still want to kind of complete the eulogy.
Okay, yeah, and what I would do, I would move up to key. I would move to 1974 because now what you'll find is that you're going to see Amiri Baraka go from being a nationalist into becoming a Marxist-Leninist, okay? And if you want to talk about when the Black Arts Movement begins and ends, I usually end it around 1974 because it's at that particular point you see the split in terms of Baraka leaving some of the teachings that he had supported from the 60s in terms of issues of race and color and stuff like that, and moving into a Marxist analysis, okay? And some of that has to do with terms of what he began to see in the continent of Africa, you know, or even people like Walter Rodney, okay? Many people that you begin to see that show up at the Sixth Pan-African Conference in Tanzania, you look at that Congress, all these black people come together, they are divided around ideology, okay? A key person who would have a tape recording speech that would be aired at the Sixth Pan-African Conference in Tanzania would be Sekou Touré. And in that speech, Sekou Touré will say this: blackness is just an accident of birth. That we are black.
An accident of birth.
That's right. The key thing is whether you are my comrade. And you know, as soon as you have that word comrade, you bring it in socialist and communist language.
That's right.
And what happened is they're saying, we want to know whether we agree in terms of what we need to do. We may all be black, you see, but are we in agreement on what we want to do? And Baraka began to see some of the contradictions of blackness in Newark politics. You see, so you know, right around 76, it's 74, 76 is a key period in terms of his development in career.
I just saw something. I think somebody posted it on Facebook. I don't know who they attributed it to, but it said something like, "Being black is not defined by the color that you are. Being black is defined by who you are." Yeah.
You know, I think this has a lot to do with those of us who are building, you know, black institutions. You know, you look up and many black institutions today are not all black. They have a lot of white people involved in it, and the key thing is, are we in agreement with what we need to do to help black people?
Yeah. Okay. So much more to talk about. We do now need to take a break. We're going to take a short one and come back with Ethelbert Miller and a whole lot more. Thanks for staying tuned.
And now, The Rock Newman Show.
Folks, welcome back. Thank you for staying tuned. You still have time to call your friends and tell them to pick us up at therocknewmanshow.com. We've got a lot more. We're finishing up this hour with the incomparable E. Ethelbert Miller, poet, author, teacher, scholar. And in the 11 o'clock hour from 11 to 12, Dr. Melanie Macklin, Dr. Mac, hair and skin specialist, dermatologist, will be here to share all things hair and skin and talk about the incredible projects that she has worked on, the movies she's been involved in, and her own products. Ethelbert, if I can come back to you for a second, if I don't kind of get this in right now, we're going to get to talking about something else, and I'm going to forget it, and we're going to run out of time. I've been accused of being over the top in my love and loyalty and admiration for Howard University. I describe Howard University as singularly the most important institution of higher learning in the world. You have done an awful, aside from being a student at Cook Hall and a student at Howard University, you've done a lot there through the years. How would you describe Howard University and its impact locally, nationally, and internationally?
Well, first, it is international. You know, we have to look at that. It's a very important institution. You remember at one time, if you were African-American dentist, doctor, or lawyer, you came from Howard University. Howard has also been the backdrop to many important historical events. When you look internationally, you know, you're Eric Williams, you know, so many people of note come here, you know. I look at the fact that when I was a student, I walked across campus and I was influenced by Leon DeMoss. I was influenced by C.L.R. James. You know, these are people, Sterling Brown, these are people just associated with the institution. So, you know, when we look at Howard University, you know, it's very important that any student that's there, okay, understand the history. Any faculty member who's there understands the history. And what happened, we're challenged today in terms of what this institution needs to do. You just can't sit back and think that you're going to win the fourth quarter. If you don't have your legs under you, you know, which is your funding and stuff like that, you'll lose your place, you know. Howard has to realize that even with among African American institutions, you know, Spelman and Hampton sometimes get mentioned before Howard. Sure. You know, so what happens is that, you know, we have to reboot. You know, we've taken some hit in the media. I've seen a number of people come back to Howard in the last several months who really love the institution, and I think that says something. You know, that people could be doing something else. They could be retired. Right. But people say, wait a minute, this institution is hurting. It needs my help. You know, it's very, very important internationally. You know, and so you see a closing of the ranks right now. Yeah.
You mentioned someone who I have a great deal of admiration for. I didn't necessarily know him when he was in the zenith of the struggle, but I got to know him later in his life. And one of the things that I've been most flattered by from a public figure was Stokely Carmichael. Kwame Ture wrote something in his book about me, which I had no idea he was going to do, and it was most flattering and complimentary. What do you say was Howard University's impact on Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture?
I'll use myself. I mean, when I came to Howard University at 17, I came here. One of the books I packed was Black Power. You know, Stokely Carmichael, Charles Hamilton's book. You know, that was key. Stokely was a student at Howard University, you know, a philosophy student. You know, getting involved in you know, like many young people involved in SNCC. And that's another part of Howard's history. You know, look at the number of people who came out of Howard who was very much involved in SNCC and changed the South. You see, when you take somebody like Bernice Reagan, you know, Bernice Reagan has a history degree, PhD, you know, from Howard University. You know, she's not just one of the freedom singers. And so, you know, when you look at Stokely Carmichael, it's very key. And in the midst of what we were talking about Baraka, if I'm not mistaken, you know, Kwame Ture will arrive on Howard's campus in 1970. And he will give a key speech in Crampton Auditorium in which he says the highest stage of Black power is Pan-Africanism. And he will introduce that term back into our vocabulary. You know, so that is extremely important. And I would say this, in today, 2014, during the time of the internet, right, I'm surprised that we don't hear people more and more saying we're Pan-Africanists. Right. Because I can pick up a phone right now and call someone in Sudan. You see? Right. But the whole thing of the language, you know, we should be Pan-Africanists. Yes. Even things like the diaspora.
I want to just jump up and give you two high fives because that's so much of what I believe.
I mean, you know, in fact, they're saying, well, we're the African diaspora. Well, we're not diverse anymore. It's not like the slave ships are out there moving around. What happens? We're all back together now.
Yeah.
Now, what's the challenge? The challenge now is that you have to tell a young black person in the Southeast you're gonna have to speak Portuguese. You see, the challenge is that you're going to have to be able to talk to somebody from Brazil or Mozambique or Angola. That's a challenge now, because what happened, if you can be texting, you're going to have to be texting more than one language.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
You want to call yourself American in 2014, you're dealing with the Americas. Don't you find it amazing that with the high rate of incarceration, especially in states like Texas and California, that black people come out of the prison systems and don't speak Spanish?
Right.
I'm amazed at that.
Yeah. Right.
And this is the thing that what happened. We have to change our thinking as we move into more further into this century.
Mm-hmm. You know what? If I can sort of do the last thing with Baraka, if you had to pick a particular poem of his.
Oh, yeah, I'll pick one. I like this one. This is one of my favorite ones. This is not the one that's going to be in one of those anthologies, but this is one I like. It's called Wives. If you ever find yourself somewhere lost and surrounded by enemies who won't let you speak in your own language, who destroy your statues and instruments, who ban your boom ba boom, then you are in trouble, deep trouble. They ban your boom ba boom, you in deep, deep trouble. Probably take you several hundred years to get out.
Boom, boom, boom. Wow. Why is that your favorite?
That's a favorite because what happens, you see Baraka, and this goes back to our beginning of our conversation, you see him weaving his appreciation for the music, history, and political consciousness, all in one short piece.
Yeah. You wrote a book. You've written books. You wrote a book, Fifth Inning.
All right. Published by Busboys and Poets.
Published by Busboys and Poets. You use the analogy of baseball, the example of baseball, in a very fascinating way. One of the fascinating figures, one of the figures that you're fascinated by, is a Japanese-born ball player, artist, by the name of Suzuki Ichiro. Ichiro Suzuki. Just simply known as Ichiro.
Right.
Why'd you choose him?
Ichiro is amazing, and many people look at him in terms of batting.
Yeah.
Okay, and keep in mind he's the first Japanese position player to really excel here in the United States, because there's always a bias in terms of whether they're big enough, hit things of that sort. But his defense is even more amazing. In terms of how many Golden Gloves this guy has won. Okay,
Right.
I mean, there are records that he's done that is amazing. But there was an interview that I read with Ichiro that took it to another level. Everybody, and this is when he was at the height of his career here in the United States. Okay, he said there was another guy, it was another Japanese player. He said that this guy who he admired had reached a point where the ball stopped.
How?
Man, when I read that,
oh my!
When I read that, I said, I wonder if the translation is correct on this. Did I read this in Japanese? They said the ball stopped.
Yeah.
Now, when's the last time you saw that?
Yeah.
The Matrix.
Yeah.
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 I mean, when you see the ball stop, you see, and you might recall, a couple of years ago.
I want to get into that.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, somebody was saying that, okay, could someone hit 400 like Ted Williams? It was the last person because of how things have changed in terms of the game of baseball.
Right.
And the first name that came up is that if anybody could do it, it would be Ichiro. Okay, and that's to hit 400 is unbelievable.
Right.
Especially in today's baseball game, not like how Ted Williams was playing.
Right. Today's baseball games where you've got people that are throwing harder, that the breaking balls are breaking more.
Right. Night games.
And night games.
Right.
And you when they lose 2 miles an hour off of the 98-mile fastball, you got somebody else that's coming in and throwing 100 miles an hour. Getting back now, his
It's
defense.
phenomenal.
What do you attribute his defensive excellence? What do you attribute his excellence?
What happened? We deal with media. There was a game a number of years ago against, I think, the Oakland A's. And what happens, a guy tried to go from first to third on Ichiro. And as the guy who announced it said, it was like a laser beam. You know, like you just put your glove there and it goes straight in there.
Yeah.
What happened, every now, an athlete, whether it's baseball, basketball, football, there is a defining moment in their career. You say that they do something that you say, wow, did I see that?
Yeah.
And this is why Monday Night Football was so key. Or the pocket passer, right? Okay, let's look at the pocket passer, right? Why do we hear the pocket passer? RG3, he's not a pocket passer. It dawned on me that I'm listening to Phil Simms call a football game.
Yeah.
That's why there's a pocket passer. Now, Troy Aikman is a pocket passer. And I realized they're all pocket passers calling the game.
Right.
So when someone like Breeze runs, he's not staying in the pocket anymore. He's running, right? You know, but the pocket passer, I said, where's this coming from? The people who are in the booth.
Yes.
They might as well say.
Who are defining.
Right.
Yes.
They might as well say, if you're going to move off the field and come up into the booth, you're going to have to be a pocket passer. Okay, I have no problem with that. But let the brothers play. You know what I'm saying? You know, and so what happened, you can see right now, going back to people like Jane Kennedy. In fact, you're a sports guy. When are the women going to move from off the sidelines up into the booth where they can be warm, or Pam not having a bad hair day? You know, in the wind out there, coming to Green Bay game. You're a sister, and you're here. Come on, please. It shows a lack of sensitivity.
You know, going back to Ichiro for a second.
Okay.
The science, his science and his positioning, because not the biggest guy in the world, not the fastest guy in the world, quick,
and you don't touch his bats either. They're taking care. They're like instruments, like like a violin. Okay, what happens? His whole approach to the game is one in which is a high art form.
Zen.
Exactly.
Zen.
You know, like this might as well be a samurai sword.
Yeah. You know, and as someone who didn't just play baseball, but who worshipped playing baseball, it was life. Baseball was life to me. And I might have told this since I've been doing this show, but there was a guy one day that we were playing. I was 13 years old and I was playing in the men's league. And there was this guy who had come back from the minor leagues of baseball that was playing for the Vista Yankees. And the Brandywine ACs was playing him that day. And I had to face this guy I was 14 then. I was 14 then, who had come back from the minor leagues, and I was scared. And our routine was we'd go to church. Couldn't wait to get out of church because we couldn't understand the Latin that the preacher that the priest was speaking. I always wondered why the hell I was there. But we'd go to church, rush out of church, and come back home and get our uniform on, man, and go and play. And I thought I was a big shot playing with the men. But now I'm scared, so I'm in church praying that I can get a hit, and I'm focusing. I'd seen this guy throw. I'd seen him pitch, and I was so focused and went into a state that I think Ichiro some sort of way learned to stay in through his career. But this one day I was in this state where the ball didn't stop, but it got real big. You know I hit 4 doubles as a 14-year-old, 4 ropes off of this left-handed guy because in church I had seen his delivery, I had seen the ball, and by the time I got on the field, the ball had slowed up and I murdered him that day.
Now, you know, you said when you said that you saw this before.
Yeah.
Charlie Rose is interviewing Willie Mays. And he go back to the great catch he made, or Vic Words, and over the last
1954 World Series Polo Grounds.
Right, and what happens? Willie Mays says to Charlie Rose, "Well, I was more impressed by getting the ball back to the infield." But then he says something else. He said, as Charlie Rose pursued it, he said, "Well, I dreamt it the night before." And Charlie Rose never followed up on that.
Yeah.
What do you mean? You saw that? What you just said?
Yeah.
That they saw this the day before, and it was just that.
Yeah. And that's a particular state. That's a particular state. And as a lover of the game of baseball, I'm so appreciative and respectful and admire how you take Ichiro and you lift him beyond just that athlete, because there's a whole lot of mental stuff going on there, and it's a whole lot of outside of ourselves stuff.
Can I read you an excerpt? This is in the fifth inning.
Please do.
That might tie in with what you're saying. This says, everything comes down to balls and strikes. You don't need religion or God to understand this. One can keep a scorecard just like God. Now and then you try to slow things down by stepping out of the box. I like how good hitters step back, adjust their uniform, stroke their bats, survey the field, spit, grab themselves between the legs, step back into the box, touch their caps, stare at the pitcher, swing the bat a few times, and maybe if you're Ricky Henderson, step back and out bounce and do it all over again.
When you step back with a whole lot of style and a little bit of hot dog.
Right, you remember the catching and the snapping?
That's right.
That's
right.
I mean, and that's something that, I guess, you bring to your show. I try to bring that there's a certain thing that you see. It might be a sense of grace, like Roberto Clemente.
Yeah.
That when you're talking sports, you're also talking about other aspects of life.
Yeah. You just mentioned Roberto Clemente, and I remember an all-star game. I think the game was in St. Louis, and it was on, July the 4th weekend, always.
When they had two all-star games.
Yeah, around that time. And I remember that beautiful black man sweating. And every time they would throw a pitch and he'd foul it off or whatever, and he'd take that hat off, and you see that bald head and that white towel, and he'd wipe himself off, and then, of course, he stroked a shot somewhere, and I remember his slide into third being such an incredible thing of beauty. What made you name the title of your book, Fifth Inning?
The Fifth Inning, when I wrote this a number of years ago, I was entering my 50s, and you've probably seen this, Rock, where you have a number of friends who don't make it through the fifth inning.
Yeah.
The fifth inning in baseball is a complete game.
Yeah.
And I think that when we look at issues of health, even in terms of people who may have had a job and think they're going to retire, all of a sudden they hit that fifth inning and their entire life changes. And the other thing tying in with like music, many baseball games, are called because of bad weather, darkness, or whatever, and I equate that with the blues. Okay? But the whole thing is that it becomes a metaphor for life, as opposed to midlife crisis. We're talking about entering the fifth inning.
Yeah. Is the fifth inning? What do you imagine the ninth inning being like?
Well, I hope there's extra innings. I hope there's extra innings. What happens is that, you reach a certain point where you ask yourself, what are the contributions that you've made? I think now, and I'll say this in terms of the larger context, I think over the last several years we've focused so much on youth. Youth. I think the focus has to be on the elderly. I go back to Julius Nyerere, who was president of Tanzania.
Yes.
And Julius Nyerere said, if you want to have an impact, on your society, you have to deal with the adults.
Yeah.
Say, or what I tell people, put your mask on first and then help somebody. So what happens? You see, there's an adult responsibility. But I think we really have to look at our elders. The same way we've now reached a point, thanks to the Pope, that all of a sudden that, poverty is something we can talk about, I always felt there were certain P words we couldn't talk about, the pussy riot, Palestinians, poverty, there are all words that start with P, we have a problem with. But what happens is that now, we can now begin to focus on our elderly, people who are in senior citizen homes, people who when there's a power short, they're in homes by themselves.
Yeah.
Okay? People who don't have their food delivered, and we have to make sure they're not invisible. You don't have the thing that you reach a certain age and then you're replaceable.
We talked about seeing things before they happen, or seeing things that weren't right before you. What I see right now is my wife, who's watching this show, and she's got a big old smile on her face because you brought up a name. That name was Julius Nyerere. She took a picture with Julius Nyerere, and he flirted with her. She shamelessly flirted back with him, and to this day calls him her boyfriend. So I see her over there smiling because you brought up that name.
Well, I better bring up that name because I met Julius Nyerere at the Sixth Pan-African Congress. And my son, his name is Nair Jabran, and I took that from Julius Nyerere. But when you talk about a man who led a country with a certain sense of humility and beauty, I mentioned it. And a couple of weeks ago, when Nelson Mandela died, I was being interviewed by South African radio, and they were talking about Nelson Mandela. I threw out the Kwame Nkrumahs and the Nyerere so that we would put Mandela in the context of other great African leaders.
Right, understood. You said earlier when I asked you about the ninth inning, you inevitably start to question about what your life's been about and what kind what kind of impact you've made. Let me get territorial and personal here just for a moment, because you are passionately involved in supporting Andy Shalal's campaign to lead Washington, D.C. as its mayor. Why?
Well, you know, there actually was an outgrowth of one of our meetings here at Busboys. I think that Mayor Gray has kept a good city good. I think that Andy can make a good city great. You know, and I think what we see here, if you go out and walk these streets right now, getting back into bumping into people you're talking about, you know, Claude Brown. Well, there's a certain tension out here.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Good word. Good word.
I call Ground Zero sometimes, you know, Lafayette Plaza, you know, Metro.
Yeah.
You really want to see the tension.
Yeah.
And what are we saying? Is that this gets back to art and writing. You have to be visionary. Okay, you can look around and say that you think the city is doing really well. Yeah. Okay, that has a lot to do with how you see. Okay, Andy's one of the few people running for mayor of this city who's talking about income inequality, who's talking about poverty, who's talking about issues of race. Okay, these are all. This is not. See, I'm from New York, you know, and this is not a southern town anymore. You know, I mean, this isn't like, you know, well, we were happy when we had segregation and we could trace our family back to free Negroes. Yeah. This isn't that type of city anymore. Yeah. It's not black and white. I tell people if you, I think Pelicano quotes me as in his last novel about, you know, the chocolate city where chocolate melts. You know, what happens if you really want to look at this city now? Look at it in terms of languages. Be in places and find out how many people speak how many languages, okay? Or go back to language and go back to what Fenty was talking about in terms of capital city. We have become a capital city. That means that it's going to be cosmopolitan. Right. It's going to be extremely diverse, okay? And the key thing that has to happen now for black people is to realize how it's going to deal with the transition. Okay, and what happened? Andy Shalala becomes unique in terms of being this person like in the middle. Yeah, you know, coalition building. The key thing is, can he manage this? Okay, you know, Gray sits and talks to a lot of the developers. Now, what's the problem with that? You go over with the developers, and you're going to develop, say, someplace in Southeast, and people have good intentions. Sure. Here come the developers, and what the developers say? We're going to have new housing, and they build new housing, and you see the sign, and it says studio apartment and 1 and 2 bedrooms. I'm a family of 6 and 7. Right. The sign doesn't even have to be translated to some other language. It says, in my language, that's not for me, you know, even though it's English, because I have a family of 6 and 7. I can't put them in there. Now, who is going to provide, you know, the road to say, okay, you're still welcome in this city? People are being displaced, and people don't want to talk about it, okay? Now, people say, okay, Andy is too far to the left. Well, I don't want to be left out. You see what I'm saying? I hope somebody is on the left because I'm feeling left out. Right. And so the question is, can Andy move from here to bring the city together? Or else we'll be Dickens. You know, I'll be a tale of two cities, you know, and what happened? You don't want to live like that. Right. You see? You don't want to live like that. And so what happens? It's a very difficult thing to balance. When people talk about Busboys, you know, they say, okay, how's this? I had a friend of mine who sat here and said, okay, this isn't a restaurant. Yeah. This is a movement. Yeah. You see, this is something bigger. Yeah. See, I tell people, like Andy's always wondered, you know, it's one of his idols is Howard Zinn. I said, well, if you embrace how people make history, okay, you make history, you know. The same way, you know, in some of these meetings we had in terms of policy and stuff like that, and say, well, you know, how many people voted in the last election? I said, this is transformative politics. Andy is doing something that you haven't seen before. Right. You know, and what somebody said, well, you know, Fenty did this, such and such. Fenty went door to door. I tell people the Mormons don't even go door to door anymore. You're going to use that? You know what I'm saying? So what happened? People cannot see or even visualize the future. And see, this is why I always fall back on being a writer, and especially being a poet. I don't want to lose my sense of vision. Okay? And what happens is that, you know, history is good. But people make history. You see? And that's the thing that I've been trying to tell people, that what's happening here, and it might have to come in stages.
If I might offer quickly a metaphor, is the first time my wife walked into this particular restaurant where we're sitting now. There was a couple. There were 3 or 4 brothers sitting there, dreadlocks and the bit, and speaking the language that you might stereotypically think that they are speaking a hip hop language. And sitting at the next table was this very refined French lady with a tam on her head, and her table and the hip hop table were getting along marvelously. And I think that's the city that Andy foresees.
Well, that's the city that we're going to have to be. The question is that whether we can keep that together.
Yeah.
You see,
and
everyone can't do that.
Yeah, and who can be the bridge to pull it together?
Right.
We're out of time.
Okay.
That means you got to come back again.
Okay, thank you, Rod.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
thank you so much,
All right,
Ebert.
thank you.
Coming up in the next hour, Dr. Melanie Macklin, Dr. Mac, hair and skin specialist. Please, a big hand for Ethelbert Miller. We want him back again. All right.